Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are going to be taking a look at the Speed Chess Championship. Now this is a very prestigious event being held on chess.com featuring 16 elite players. Now yours truly, myself, Grandmaster Hikaru, I am the 5-time defending champion, but there are many other strong players in this event including Magnus Carlsen, Wesley So, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, etc. Now today was the first semifinal match between Magnus Carlsen and Wesley So, two players who need no introduction whatsoever. So let's jump right into the action. So the first game we're going to be taking a look is the first game of the match with Magnus Carlsen having the white pieces against Wesley So with the black pieces. Now today Wesley played in the Armageddon event being held in Berlin, Germany. He had a very good result, bagging 20,000 euros. As such, a little bit unclear how he would come out against Magnus Carlsen in the Speed Chess Championship considering how late at night this event was being held. All right. So game number one, we get e4 from Magnus. Wesley plays e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and here Wesley plays a6. Now Wesley is one of the biggest proponents of the Berlin defense with knight to f6. This has been played by famous players including the former world chess champion Vladimir Kramnik, who used it very effectively against the then reigning world champion Garry Kasparov all the way back in the year 2000 or 2001. Years get blurred in my mind. At any rate, back to the game. Wesley plays a6 first, surprise, because normally he plays the Berlin defense. We get bishop a4, knight to f6, d3, bishop c5, all pretty standard so far. We get bishop g5, h6, bishop to h4, and here Wesley plays this move d6, and now Magnus plays this interesting idea with pawn to d4. Now d4 is an interesting idea because Magnus has already played d2 to d3. So by going d2 to d3 here, he pushed the pawn forward one square, and now a couple moves later he's pushing the pawn forward, so he's essentially gone d2 d3 d3 d4, using two turns to get the pawn to d4 instead of a standard one turn or one go with d2 to d4. So after d4 we get e takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop d7, bishop takes c6, Wesley takes with the bishop. Now this is already a little bit unusual. Probably Wesley should have taken with the pawn here, keeping the two bishops alive in this position, but he decides to take with the bishop, which still should be relatively okay. Magnus trades off on c6 and plays the move knight to d2 here, guarding the pawn on e4 and preparing to castle his king. Wesley castles, Magnus plays queen to f3, and here we get this move rook to e8 from Wesley. And now, true to form, Magnus Carlsen, one of the greatest endgame players ever, I would say, if not the greatest, decides to go right into an endgame here where the material is even, but Magnus is a knight versus bishop, and on top of that Wesley has two stacks of double pawns on c7 and c6 and f7 and f6 as well. We get castles, f5 here, nice move by Wesley getting rid of one set of the double pawns. Magnus plays rook fe1 here because if you were to take the pawn you run into the classic kebab with rook to e2 here, hitting the knight, targeting all the pawns on the 7th rank, and with the rook and the bishop combined, black should be okay. If white plays a move like rook d1, black can go king g7 with the idea of king f6, capturing the pawn, and white's pieces are really paralyzed here. You don't want to move the knight away because then you hang c2, potentially b2 and a2. You can't move this rook to e1 to contest the e file because then bishop takes f2 would simply win the game. So if you can't move the knight, can't move the rooks, black king is coming in and you have this great activity. Black should be doing very, very well here. So Magnus plays rook fe1, we get rook a b8, rook a b1, fe4, knight e4, and now we have the move bishop to d4. Computer here thinking this position is relatively balanced, but nonetheless Magnus still has a small advantage because of the knight versus bishop situation. So we get pawn to b3, king g7 is played, and here Magnus goes knight g3. Now computer really likes g4 simply to stop f5, and then after a move like king g6 there might be knight g3 and knight f5 with a nice bashing. For example, bishop e5, knight f5 here. I guess here black might have h5, but nonetheless the concept of the knight with the pawn can be very strong. So Magnus goes knight g3, we get king g6, rook takes rook, rook takes rook, king to f1 is played, and now Wesley plays a5 here, trying to push the pawn to a4, maybe even trading off the a pawns and then using the a file for the rook. Magnus plays rook e1 and Wesley goes rook a8. Now in a blitz game specifically, it's very hard to calculate what's going on here, and you don't really want to trade the rooks here because you end up in a situation with a bishop versus knight, but white has no double pawns. White can also put all the pawns on the opposite color of the bishop. Bishop can never attack any of these pawns, and just in general white will always have ideas to maneuver the knight all over the board. So We get rook to a8 from Wesley, which is a fairly serious mistake because now Magnus plays rook to e4. We get c5, protecting the bishop or the wooden shield on d4. But now after rook to g4, king f6, and knight to e2, Wesley plays bishop e5, and we get this move rook a4. And now the position starts to become very difficult for black to defend for a couple of reasons. First one is your rook on a8 is tied down defending this pawn on a5. Secondly, this rook can swing back and forth between h4 and a4. It just keeps swinging every which way back and forth, and you can go after both the pawns on the a5 square as well as the pawn on h6. Additionally, black can't really push these pawns forward because if you go d5, for example, you create a weakness here where the c5 pawn can become a little bit weak after, say, knight f4, c6, and knight to d3, bishop d6, and c4. And now the pawn on c5 is always a little bit loose. So Wesley plays king to e6, Magnus plays g3 here. A simple move to potentially support knight f4, supports rook h4, but also creates a nice square for the king. And last but not least, white can always play f4 if need be as well. So a very multi-purpose move here with g3 from Magnus, and very good understanding that even though he's putting the pawns on the same color as the bishop, it's better than playing a move like h3 here. So we get g3, d5 is played, rook h4, bishop g7, and now king to g2 is played by Magnus. A quiet move here, just putting the king on the second rank and intending to put the knight on f4 on the next turn. Wesley plays d4, and this is a fatal blunder. Now, again, this is a situation where the players are playing a blitz game. They don't have all the time in the world to think, but it's very, very hard to play in this position with the black pieces because you're defending, but you have no obvious trades or even obvious ideas. So Wesley here plays d4, and I think the reason behind playing d4 is he figured, well, maybe he'll be able to go something like c4, rook b8, maybe activate the rook and draw the game potentially. But by playing d4, Wesley also fixes his pawns here to where he no longer has any flexibility. You can no longer push either c4 or d3 without hanging a pawn. So after d4 is played, we get this move knight to f4 from Magnus. Wesley goes king d6, and now we have rook h5, and it starts to become very clear what the problem is. Now instead of swinging the rook back and forth between a4 and h4 to attack these two pawns with the swing, white intends to go rook f5 and pressure both the pawns on c5 as well as the pawn on f7, and black is going to have great difficulty defending both of these pawns. So Wesley goes a4, Magnus plays knight d3, and now we see the big issue because the pawn on c5, if you push forward, white captures the pawn, and the only other way to guard it is rook a5 potentially, but after rook a5, white has b4 here. You cannot take the pawn because of the pin, and you lose the game. And if you play rook to b5, for example, I'm not sure if rook takes c5 is the cleanest, but rook c5 is good, rook f5 is also very good, and white should be winning the game eventually. So Wesley trades on b3, decides to play the move pawn to c4 here, simply trying to get rid of one of his double pawns, give white the double pawns, and then play rook a2 and try to win back the extra pawn. So we get rook to a2, but now Magnus plays rook to d5 check, and Wesley has to go king e7, because if you go king c6, spaghetti-o, there's knight b4, forking the king and the rook. So we get king to e7, and now we have knight b4 played anyway, attacking the rook while guarding the pawn and intending to fork the king on e7 and the pawn on d4. Wesley plays rook a4. We get this move knight to c6 check, king to f6 is played. Magnus captures the pawn on d4, and already here white now simply has two extra pawns, and with this terrible bishop that can't target any of the pawns here, it's just hopeless. The game concludes after king to e6. Magnus plays rook f4. We get this move rook a2, knight to d8 check, forking the king and the pawn, and here Wesley So resigns the game, because if he goes king d6, white can play rook takes f7, let's just say bishop c3 for argument's sake, and white can go c5 check. King cannot stay next to his pawn on c7, and after you take on c5, rook c7, king b4. There are many ways for white to be winning, but rook h7 is probably the simplest, with rook takes c2, rook takes h6, and with three extra pawns to be pushed up the board, Magnus Carlsen will definitely convert this position. So very bad start for Wesley So. He loses his first game of the match, and he goes down 1-0. So let's move to the second game. So they're playing 5+1 for 90 minutes. So after losing this very tough first game, Wesley wants to try and strike back. So the first big surprise here is that Wesley plays the move b3. Now clearly bro thinks he's Hikaru, because Hikaru more than anyone else has played setups with 1b3 or knight f3 followed by b3 simply more times than anybody else online. So we get b3, which I think is the first time that Wesley probably a little bit tired after his victory in the Armageddon event today in Germany, and he's not perhaps studying for this match. So we get b3, d5, bishop b2, and now Magnus plays bishop f5. Now in the World Blitz and Rapid Championship, I believe last year in 2022, bishop g4 was played by none other than the chess bra himself, Eric Hansen, against Magnus Carlsen. Magnus played the move f3. I believe the game continued something like bishop f5 and e3. Magnus would go on to crush Eric and win the game, but he has a lot of experience on both sides of this position. So instead, Magnus plays bishop f5. We get knight f3, h6, g3, e6, bishop to g2, knight f6 castles, all pretty standard so far. Reason Magnus plays h6, by the way, is that if white ever tries to play g3, e6, and knight h4, the bishop always has a home on the h7 square. If you don't play h6, let's say you go e6, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, and knight h4, you will probably end up exchanging the knight for the bishop because you can't retreat it to h7. This is also very similar to the London system, where white usually goes bishop f4 and h3, specifically so the bishop can retreat to h2. So back to the game, we get knight f6 castles, bishop e7, d3, castles, knight bd2, bishop h7, and now knight e5 is played here by Wesley. Now once again, I'm not exactly sure when the last time I played this position with the white pieces was, but I'm almost certain that I've had this position in many rapid and blitz games over the board in the previous Grand Chess Tour events. So we get knight e5 here, a5 is played, a3, Magnus goes knight fd7, we get knight takes knight, knight takes knight, e4, and here Magnus plays bishop f6, trying to trade off the dark square bishops. Wesley decides to trade the bishops, Magnus takes, we get queen e2, and here c6 is played to create the classic triangle pawn formation in the center of the board. So after c6, Wesley plays e5, we get knight d7, f4, and now the move queen c7 played here by Magnus. Now I was doing live commentary of this match on my Kick channel, and I felt at this point in the game it was already looking bad for Wesley, for the simple fact that in blitz specifically, you want positions where you have easy moves to play, you don't have to think for a long time, and in this situation all the pressure is on white to prove an advantage or come up with a plan, whereas black has very simple ideas and can react to whatever white does. So for white, you want to try and go g4, f5 and play on the king side, or potentially play something like c4. Whereas for black, it's very easy. Black wants to play something like, let's just say h3, a4, b4, and c5, trying to open up the c file here and put a lot of pressure towards the white king, or even something like b5, let's just say rook e1, and then rook c8, let's say rook f1, c5, and very, very quickly, black has a big advantage. So Wesley plays knight f3, Magnus goes a4, which is surprisingly a mistake here, and I think that Magnus actually misunderstood the pawn structure, which is very, very rare for Magnus. He almost never misunderstands the position, but in this case he does make some mistakes. We get a4, b4, c5 is played, pawn takes pawn, queen takes, and here Wesley goes queen f2, and the reason that Magnus has misunderstood the position is that white wants to put this great knight on d4 where it will pressure the pawn on e6, but for example, after say queen c7, knight d4, no f6 because the knight takes pawn. You also, if you go rook a c8, white can simply go rook b1 and try to put pressure on both the pawns on b7 and a4, all the while the knight guards the base of the pawn chain here, and quite simply white has a big advantage. So Magnus goes rook f c8, offering another endgame, and here Wesley trades the queens, which is a good decision. You get rook takes queen, but now this move knight d4 is played, and this is a fairly serious mistake from Wesley, because what Wesley needed to do was play this move rook a2, so that when rook a c8 is played, knight d4 guards the pawn, and after knight to b8, you now have this very unusual idea with bishop h3, stopping knight c6, offering the trade of the knights, because if knight c6 is played, you can sack the horse, and after bishop takes pawn, you simply check the king and win the rook on c8. So after knight d4, knight b8 is played. Now you no longer have bishop h3. Black is going to play knight c6, remove the knight from d4, which guards the base of this pawn chain, which is so vital to prevent this dark or this black light square bishop from coming into the game, and now black should be fine. So we get rook fb1 being played. Magnus goes knight c6, Wesley trades the knights, and now he plays rook a2, and here Magnus makes a mistake by playing g5. In this position, it was imperative that Magnus play rook c3 and try to activate this bishop as fast as possible, because after a move like king f2 is played, you have c5. Let's say king e3 is played here, you go d4, king d2, and rook c8 followed by c4, and suddenly black is going to have this double stack. The bishop is coming to life from h7, and black should be doing quite well. So we get g5 being played. Wesley goes king f2, we get rook a5 here, because now if you go rook c3 after king e3 and c5, suddenly king d2 traps the rook, because if you go d4 you simply lose your rook on a8. So Magnus plays rook a5, Wesley goes king e3, and the reason this position is so bad is this bishop on h7 is simply staring at a pawn wall and cannot be activated. So we get king g7, king d2 is played here, Magnus goes bishop f5, Wesley plays rook b4, an excellent move to guard the pawn on f4, all the while targeting the pawn on a4, and black simply has no way to really break the structure. So we get rook c b5, rook a b2 is played here by Wesley, the rook trade happens, we get this move g4, and now rook b6 is played, attacking the pawn on c6. Magnus plays c5, and here Wesley plays an excellent move c4, and the reason this move is so good is that in this position what black would love to do is play something like h5, rook a8, rook b2, and then h4, let's say rook b1, rook h8, and try to activate the rook on this h file. So when Wesley plays c4, Magnus has to trade the pawns, but now black cannot get the rook around to h8 because the bishop on g2 simply covers the square. So we get rook a7, and here Wesley plays this move bishop c6, which is maybe not the worst move, but rook b7 would have been better here because if black goes rook a8, you can go for the fossil with rook takes pawn check, king takes rook, bishop takes rook, and after say bishop g6, bishop c6, white will win a second pawn, have 2 extra pawns, and it should be a pretty simple conversion. So we get bishop c6 instead, and also after rook b7, rook a6, for example, white can now go king c3. Again, there's no rook a8, and if black can't get the rook to h8 and play h5, h4, white should survive and or potentially win the game. So we get bishop c6, Magnus goes h5, king e3 is played, and this is a big mistake as well. Once again, rook b7 would have been the best move, because after rook a6, there's this move bishop e8, pressuring the pawn on f7, and after bishop g6, you can now go, I believe, is it rook b8 here to stop rook a8, rook h8, followed by king to c3, or even rook c8 going after the pawn on c5. Instead, Wesley plays king e3, and now after rook c7, suddenly all of the advantage is gone. And the reason the advantage is gone is that if you ever take on a4, there's rook a7 to win either the bishop or the pawn, and even if you don't take the pawn, the rook is always going to be able to get over to h8, and black is going to be able to create some serious counterplay on the king side. So we get bishop b5, rook to c8 is played here, we get rook c6, Magnus of course plays rook to d8 here, trying to go for the kebab with rook to d3, hitting the king and the pawn at the same time. We get rook d6, rook h8, and now white cannot capture the pawn, and black is getting all the counterplay in the world with h4 and hg3 and rook h3. So Wesley goes rook c6 back, Magnus plays h4, we get rook takes pawn, the swap, rook h3, targeting the pawn on g3, king f2, rook h2, king g1, rook a2, and just like that, Magnus Carlsen has achieved a winning position. So we get bishop takes a4, rook takes a3, Magnus temporarily down a pawn, but he's going to win this pawn on g3, and he's going to have a free g pawn to push up the board. We get bishop c6, rook g3, king f2, rook c3, and now black can go g3. White can't really do anything, the rook is in front of the pawn, can't push p up the board, and this should be technically winning. So we get bishop b7, bishop d3, rook c7, bishop c4, we get king g1 played, not bishop a6 by the way, because after g3 you would lose the game. If you go king g1, there's rook c1 check, king g2, and then bishop d5 check, creating the fossil, and after king takes pawn, rook takes rook, black wins the game. So Wesley goes king g1, Magnus plays g3, we get rook d7 here, again bishop a6, same problem with rook c1 and bishop d5. So we get rook d7, rook c2 is played here, we get bishop e4, rook to f2, rook to d4 is played, and here Magnus plays bishop e2, which is a mistake. Now mind you, the players are very low on time at this point in the game, Magnus with 13 seconds versus Wesley with 3, but bishop to f1 would have actually won the game here, and the reason is kind of amazing. White would love to go rook d3 hitting the pawn on g3, but that's not an option. And essentially if you play a move like rook d1 after bishop to h3, there's always this massive threat of rook f1 mate, but also rook takes pawn, and there's no way to save this pawn on f4, because if you go rook d3, there's rook f1 mate, and if you play like bishop d3, I just take the pawn, or even king h6, king h5, king h4, and it's all hopeless. But Magnus goes bishop e2, Wesley plays bishop g2, we get bishop g4, rook d3, and now after rook f4 and rook g3, Wesley is only a little bit worse here. Now probably this is still winning with perfect play, but Magnus is not actually able to convert in this endgame. Wesley miraculously saves us with seconds on the clock, eventually proving that he does have great defensive skills here. I don't really need to go over all the moves per se, but eventually Wesley is able to draw this game. He gets this endgame with a rook, bishop, and pawn versus rook and bishop, and this is technically drawn, and the game does end peacefully after quite a few more moves. Eventually Magnus starts trying to push the pawn. He pushes the pawn to e4, allowing rook f4, pinning the bishop and the king, and winning the pawn on e4. And after king g5, rook e4, rooks come off, and the game is a draw. So very, very difficult game for Wesley. He went from probably winning to losing to drawing. Objectively, it should be good, though, since he's only down by 1 game after 2 games in the match. So let's move to the 3rd game in the 5+1 portion, where Magnus has the white pieces. So we get e4, c5, knight f3, d6. We get the Najdorf system from Wesley, a clear sign that he wants to be more outside of his general solid repertoire and take some chances. Magnus goes bishop e2, we get e5, knight b3, bishop e7, bishop g5, and here Wesley plays the move bishop e6. Now, again, I was doing live coverage of this game on my Kick channel, and I actually told my viewers about a very funny story, which is all the way back in the year 2011. I was playing this tournament called Bosna Kings in Romania. It was a tournament featuring Magnus, Timur Radjabov, as well as some local Romanians, including Liviu Dieter Nisipianu. Now, at that time, I was also working with the famous former world champion, Garry Kasparov, also known as the inventor of this great game of chess. And I remember that during the game against Nisipianu, I was not expecting this bishop g5 line, so I decided at the board to change it up and play this move knight bd7. Now, the game would end in a draw, but I was under some pressure throughout the game. And the funny thing about that game is that afterwards, Gary asked me, he's like, why didn't you play bishop e6? Bishop e6 is completely equal. Why did you play knight bd7? So when I saw this in the game today between Magnus and Wesley, it jogged that hilarious memory of that game. And then Wesley did play bishop e6. We get bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, queen d3, knight c6, and castles. And here we have this move knight d4. Now, in another fate of irony, I actually played this exact system against Grandmaster Benjamin Bach in the evening titled Tuesday today. So it's something that is quite playable for white. Generally, it's considered pretty dry. So we get knight c6, castles, knight d4, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, knight d5, takes. And here we have an opposite color bishop situation where black has the double pawns, but you have maybe the open c, open e file. Objectively, this should be a draw. But again, if anybody's a little bit better, it's probably white due to the obvious ideas of pushing the pawns on the king side. So we get castles, queen to f3 played by Magnus, rook e8, bishop to d3, activating the bishop on the perfect diagonal, all the while stopping black from playing d3. There are situations where black would like to play something like d3 and get queen b6 and put a lot of pressure on this pawn on b2. And even though you sacked a pawn, I guess here it doesn't work, you have queen f5, but nonetheless, it looks very, very scary on first glance. So Magnus is able to put the bishop on the optimal diagonal. Black does not have d3 to open up the scope for the bishop, and the game continues with rook e5. We get king b1. Wesley plays queen to a5, trying to win this pawn on d5. Magnus goes g4. We get rook e8, h4, just pushing the p on the king side. Wesley plays queen takes pawn. The queens are traded. We get a3 here by Magnus. Just a quiet little move, creating look for the king. White still is g5 or f4 lurking, and it's actually a little bit tricky for black to play. Now, whether Magnus understood this or not, it's hard to tell, but it seems as though he had a pretty good grasp that even though he's down a pawn here, it's a double pawn, and there are some serious positional difficulties for black. So here Wesley plays h6. Magnus goes f4, trying to play g5 and forces bishop away from the f6 square. And now Wesley plays this move g6. Now, this looks very harmless, this move f4, but there's a very menacing threat besides g5, which we'll see after this move g6. Now, what Wesley had to play was either rook a5 or rook c5, and the reason is because after g6, white has b4. And spaghetti-o, this rook has no squares on this 4th rank. All these squares are covered by pawns, and now you can't go to a5 or c5. You also can't go to b5. So the rook on d5 is essentially trapped. So Wesley plays b5 here, trying to stop bishop c4. So if you play rook d8, bishop c4, you lose your rook. So he goes b5, stopping bishop c4, but Magnus has rook a e1 here. And the idea is Magnus just wants to go bishop e4 and trap the rook from the other diagonal. We get rook e3 being played here. Magnus goes g5, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, bishop g7, and after bishop to e4, Wesley So resigns the game as his rook is simply trapped. He could sack the rook for the bishop, but after rook takes bishop, rook takes rook, let's just say king f8, rook de1, white has a double stack, the rooks are infiltrating, and it's totally hopeless. So Wesley loses this game and falls behind by a score of 2.5 to half. The match would progressively get worse and worse for Wesley. He would end up losing by a score of 22-7, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So a massive victory for Magnus. Simply nobody has been able to put up much resistance against him thus far in the SCC. As such, he advances to the grand finals, which will be held on Friday. Of course, tomorrow we have the other semifinal match between Grandmaster Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and yours truly, myself, Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura. Now, I have won this event 5 times in a row. Tomorrow will be a very stiff test as well. But again, I'm really looking forward to it, and we'll see how it goes. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of the Speed Chess Championship. Make sure to smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already. And I will be back tomorrow with a recap after my match against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, whether I win or whether I lose in the semifinals of the Speed Chess Championship held on chess.com. So I'll see you guys soon. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your evening. Bye.